Invisible Hands, Episode 1, How Manipulation Actually Works. Hello, and welcome to the podcast, Invisible Hands. Before we begin, I'd like to slow down. Not because what we're talking about is dramatic or dangerous, but because the subject itself has a way of speeding people up. It can trigger scanning, suspicion, self-doubt, and even fear. And that's not the state this work is meant to be received in. So take a breath and treat it as a moment of arrival. You're not here to be convinced of anything. You're not here to be warned about everyone around you. And you're certainly not here to be told who is good or bad. This is Invisible Hands, a series about manipulation, power, and the psychology of influence. But more precisely, it's a series about how perception gets shaped before we realize it's happening. This podcast is not about diagnosing people. It's not about labeling ex-partners, colleagues, family members, spiritual leaders, or strangers as narcissists, sociopaths, psychopaths, or anything else. It's not about turning psychological language into a weapon or using insight as a way to elevate oneself above others. And it's not about demonizing mental illness. That matters because a lot of harm is done when complex human behavior is flattened into caricature. When language meant to explain becomes language used to punish. When insight becomes identity. What this is about is patterns. Patterns of influence. Patterns of control. Patterns that don't announce themselves as control, but quietly reorganize how you relate to yourself, to others, and to reality. I'm not here to label people. We're here to understand patterns that leave predictable damage. Because one of the most overlooked truths about manipulation is this. It rarely feels like manipulation at first. It doesn't usually come with shouting, threats, or overt dominance. It doesn't always involve cruelty or obvious intent. Often, it begins with something far more subtle. It begins with confusion. A sense that something doesn't quite line up, but not enough to justify alarm. A feeling that you're slightly off balance, but not enough to call it harm. Moments where you leave interactions feeling smaller, foggier, or less certain, yet unable to explain why. And because those moments don't look dramatic, people often dismiss them. Or worse, they turn the question inward. What's wrong with me? Why am I reacting like this? Why can't I just let this go? This is where manipulation hides best, not in fear, but in self-doubt. So in this first episode, we're not going to start with types of people. We're not going to start with labels. And we're not going to start with pathology. We're going to start with experience. Because manipulation doesn't begin in theory. It begins in the body. Before you have language, before you have clarity, before you have a coherent narrative, something shifts, your energy drops, your attention fragments, your sense of orientation weakens. And if you've never been taught to listen to that level of signal, you assume the problem is you. This series exists to gently correct that assumption, not by telling you what to think, not by giving you a checklist of red flags, and not by turning you into someone who scans the world for threats, but by helping you recognize how influence actually works before it hardens into belief, identity, or self-erasure. Psychological language here is not moral judgment. When terms like manipulation, narcissism, or psychopathy appear in this series, they are not being used to condemn individuals. They are being used to describe strategies, patterns, and relational dynamics that can emerge wherever power, insecurity, fear, or unmet needs exist. And spiritual language, when it appears, is not delusion. Many people describe experiences of manipulation, coercion, or prolonged psychological pressure in spiritual terms, not because they're irrational, but because what happened to them bypassed logic. It touched something pre-verbal, identity level, existential. Rather than dismissing that language, this series will translate it. Because what matters isn't which vocabulary you use, it's whether the experience is understood. Understanding begins not with accusation, but with orientation. One of the most damaging myths about manipulation is that it only happens to naive people, or weak people, or unintelligent people. That simply isn't true. In fact, many forms of manipulation work better on people who are reflective, conscientious, empathetic, or self-critical, people who assume good faith, people who look inward before they accuse outward, people who want to understand rather than dominate. So if you're listening to this and thinking, I should have seen it, pause. That belief is often the final stage of the harm, because manipulation isn't a failure to notice obvious danger. It's a gradual recalibration of what feels normal. The earliest signals of that recalibration aren't intellectual. They're somatic, a tightening, a dullness, a sense of effort where there shouldn't be effort, a fatigue that doesn't match the situation. You might notice yourself talking less, explaining more, second-guessing instincts you once trusted. Because there's no single event you can point to, you rationalize it. They didn't mean it. They're just intense. I'm probably overreacting. Everyone has contradictions. This is why this episode begins where it does. Not with definitions, but with recognition. Because before we talk about narcissistic strategies, sociopathic patterns, dark empathy, or anything else, we need to understand how confusion gets created in the first place. We need to understand how influence can operate without force, how control can exist without commands, how power can shape perception while appearing benign. Most importantly, we need to understand why the body often knows something is wrong long before the mind is willing to admit it. This is not about turning you into someone who distrusts everyone. It's about restoring something far more fundamental, trust in your own perception, not blind trust, not certainty, but respect for the signals that arise before explanation. Because the cost of ignoring those signals isn't just staying in uncomfortable situations longer than you should. It's slowly losing contact with yourself. This series isn't about becoming hypervigilant. It's about becoming present, about recognizing when an interaction asks you to shrink, disappear, or override your internal compass, and learning to pause there, rather than pushing through it. So as we begin, I invite you to listen in a particular way, not as a detective, not as a judge, and not as someone looking for confirmation of past harm. Listen for resonance. Listen for moments where something in you recognizes what's being described, even if you don't yet have language for it, even if you're not sure what to do with it, even if part of you wants to dismiss it. Nothing in this episode requires action. There is no call to confront, no instruction to cut people off, no demand to reinterpret your entire life. This is about orientation, not decision-making, understanding the terrain before choosing a path. And with that grounding in place, we can begin where manipulation often begins, not with cruelty, not with dominance, but with something much quieter. A conversation, an interaction, a moment where nothing overtly wrong happened, and yet something inside you shifted. Let's start there. Recognition before explanation. I once met someone who talked a lot, and I don't mean lively conversation or the kind of enthusiastic sharing that happens when two people are genuinely curious about one another. I mean sustained, relentless talking, hours of it. Stories that folded into other stories, tangents branching into tangents, details layered upon details until the original point, if there ever was one, became impossible to locate. At first, I didn't think much of it. Some people are verbal processors. Some people are anxious. Some people are lonely. I've always been fairly tolerant of that. I'm patient. I listen. I try to understand where people are coming from. So I listened. But after a while, something started to happen in my body. A heaviness. A kind of mental fatigue that didn't feel proportional to what was actually going on. It wasn't boring. It wasn't irritating. It was more like my system was being slowly drained, like a battery running low, not because it was working hard, but because something in the environment was pulling energy without replenishing it. Eventually, I reached a point where I had to say it out loud. I can't talk anymore. I'm exhausted. Not emotionally upset. Not overwhelmed by conflict. Just done. Empty. Like there was nothing left to give. That moment stands out now, not because of what I said, but because of how unusual it felt to have to say it at all. Conversations don't normally end that way. You don't usually have to explicitly declare a limit on listening, as if you've reached a physical threshold. And yet, there I was. What I didn't fully realize at the time was that the exhaustion wasn't just coming from the volume of words. It was coming from what those words were doing. Because as these conversations continued over time, I began to notice something else, something far more subtle than talking too much. Contradictions, not blatant lies. Nothing dramatic or obviously false. Just small inconsistencies. A story told one way one day, and then slightly differently another. Details that shifted. Motivations that subtly changed. Events that seemed to rearrange themselves, depending on the context in which they were being described. At first, I treated it the way most people do. I assumed it was normal. Memory is imperfect. People misremember. Perspectives change. No one tells the same story exactly the same way every time. I told myself all of that. I prided myself on being reasonable, flexible, and understanding. But something curious began to happen. Instead of questioning them, I began questioning myself. Did I hear that right? Am I remembering this accurately? Maybe I misunderstood. Maybe I'm reading too much into it. And that's where the confusion really set in. Because it wasn't just about the content of what was being said. It was about the effect it was having on me. Each conversation left me feeling slightly less sure of my own recall, slightly less anchored in what I thought I knew, slightly more dependent on their version of events to make sense of what was happening. There was no argument, no moment of open disagreement, no explicit claim that I was wrong. And yet, over time, I felt myself becoming quieter, more hesitant, less inclined to challenge or clarify, not because I believed them more, but because I trusted myself less. That distinction matters. When manipulation is portrayed in films or online discourse, it's often shown as overt deception. Someone is lying, someone blatantly gaslighting, someone insisting that something never happened when it clearly did. But in real life, it's rarely that crude. More often, it's an accumulation of micro-disorientations, tiny ruptures in continuity, small inconsistencies that don't rise to the level of confrontation, but nevertheless erode your confidence in your own perception. And because nothing overtly bad is happening, you don't feel justified in reacting strongly. You don't feel entitled to draw boundaries. You certainly don't feel comfortable accusing someone of manipulation. So you internalize it. You tell yourself you're tired, or stressed, or distracted, or overly sensitive. You rationalize the discomfort rather than honor it. That's what I did. What I didn't understand at the time was that my body was already responding to something my mind hadn't yet named. I felt foggy after these conversations, not emotionally distressed, just dull, like my internal clarity had been smudged. Decisions felt heavier, thoughts felt slower. Even when I tried to replay what had been said, it felt strangely difficult to reconstruct the sequence cleanly. That difficulty became another source of self-doubt. If I can't even remember it clearly, who am I to question it? And this is one of the most important things to understand about early-stage manipulation. It doesn't require intent, and it doesn't require malice. All it requires is a dynamic in which your internal reference point begins to weaken. At no point did this person say, "You're wrong." At no point did they accuse me of misunderstanding. At no point did they overtly assert dominance. And yet, somehow, the center of gravity in the interaction kept shifting away from me. Their voice filled the space. Their narrative became the dominant frame. Their interpretation subtly replaced my own, not through force, but through sheer saturation. Words can do that, especially when they arrive without pause, without space for reflection, without room for your own thoughts to land. And this is where something important needs to be said. Confusion is not neutral. We tend to treat confusion as a passive state, a lack of understanding, a temporary gap that will resolve itself if we just think harder. But in relational contexts, confusion can be induced. It can be the byproduct of certain interaction styles, whether consciously deployed or not. When someone talks continuously, without checking in, without inviting reciprocity, without leaving space for your responses to shape the exchange, something subtle happens to your nervous system. You stop orienting outward. You stop tracking your own internal signals. You go into a kind of holding pattern. You listen, you absorb, you wait for it to end. And in that state, your capacity for critical reflection diminishes. Not because you're incapable, but because the conditions for clarity aren't present. This isn't a moral judgment about the other person. It's an observation about what happens in bodies under certain relational conditions. Extended monologue, shifting narratives, emotional intensity without resolution. These things tax the system. They demand attention without offering grounding. They create motion without orientation. Over time, that can destabilize your sense of self in ways that are difficult to articulate. I remember moments where I would replay conversations afterwards, trying to pinpoint exactly what felt off. And I couldn't. Not because nothing had happened, but because the discomfort wasn't located in a single sentence or claim. It was ambient, like background noise you don't consciously notice until it stops. And because I couldn't isolate the source, I turned the analysis inward. Why am I so affected by this? Why can't I just let it go? Why do I feel so drained after talking to this person? Those questions sound reasonable on the surface, reflective even, but notice what they assume. They assume the problem is internal. They assume that the external interaction is neutral, and the reaction is excessive. That assumption is where many people get stuck. Because when harm doesn't like harm, we pathologize the response instead. We tell ourselves we're too sensitive, too analytical, too easily overwhelmed. We downplay the signal because we can't justify it intellectually. But bodies don't require justification. They respond to patterns, not explanations. And what my body was responding to was not just the talking, but the structure of the interaction. There was no shared rhythm, no mutual pacing, no sense of co-regulation. It was as if I was being used as a surface, a place for words to land, rather than a participant in a shared exchange. That matters more than we tend to admit. Because human nervous systems are not designed for endless one-way transmission. We are relational organisms. We regulate through reciprocity, through feedback, through the subtle dance of listening and responding. When that dance breaks down, even in the absence of overt hostility, something inside us begins to contract. I didn't recognize that at the time. I just knew I felt smaller, less certain of my thoughts, less inclined to speak, more cautious about asserting boundaries. And here's the part that's hardest to articulate, but most important to name. The confusion didn't feel like confusion. It felt like me. It felt like a flaw in my attention, a lapse in my memory, a failure of my processing. There was no external marker telling me something is happening to you, which meant there was no obvious reason to stop. This is how subtle influence works, not by overpowering you, but by slowly relocating authority away from your own internal sense-making. And again, this isn't about accusing the other person of deliberate manipulation. It's about recognizing a dynamic, one in which the conditions for clarity are consistently undermined. When I look back now, with more distance, I can see how early the signals were. The fatigue, the fog, the quiet self-doubt. But at the time, I didn't trust them, because I had been conditioned, like many people, to prioritize being reasonable over being responsive, to value coherence over sensation, to distrust anything that couldn't be neatly explained. So I stayed longer than I should have. I listened more than was sustainable. I second-guessed signals that were trying to orient Maine. And that's the moment this episode is really about. Not the dramatic fallout, not the later understanding, but that early, almost invisible phase where something in you knows, before you can explain what it knows. This is where manipulation, influence, and control often begin. Not with cruelty, not with domination, but with misalignment. With interactions that leave you slightly less yourself each time. With conversations that don't feel like exchanges, but like extractions. With dynamics that quietly train you to doubt your own perception. If you've ever found yourself in that space, unsure whether something is wrong, but increasingly sure that you are, then this series is for you. Because the most important thing to understand, right at the start, is this. You don't need proof to honor a pattern. You don't need certainty to respect a signal. And you don't need to demonize anyone to acknowledge that something isn't working. Recognition comes before explanation. And once recognition is allowed, clarity can begin to return, slowly, gently, without force. That's where we're going next. But first, it's enough to notice this. Confusion is not always a lack of understanding. Sometimes it's the effect of a relational pattern. And if you felt it, you're not imagining it. From recognition to mapping. If you recognized yourself anywhere in that experience, it's important to pause here for a moment. Not to analyze it, not to judge it, and not to rush toward explanation. Because what you've just heard isn't evidence of wrongdoing, pathology, or intent. It's evidence of impact. And impact is always the first thing we're allowed to name. One of the reasons experiences like this are so destabilizing is that they sit in a grey zone. Nothing bad enough seems to have happened. There's no single sentence you can quote, no clear violation you can point to. Just a gradual shift in energy, in clarity, in self-trust. When we don't have a framework for understanding that shift, we do what most people do. We personalize it. We assume the confusion is a flaw. We assume the fatigue means we're weak. We assume the doubt means we're unreliable narrators of our own experience. But before we turn inward like that, there's a more useful question to ask. What conditions tend to produce this kind of effect in people? That question changes everything, because it moves us away from blame, both of ourselves and of others, and toward pattern recognition. It allows us to look at dynamics instead of identities, processes instead of personalities, and that's what we need next. So in the next section, we're going to zoom out. We're going to look at the map of manipulation, not in terms of villains or diagnoses, but in terms of mechanisms. Repeating processes that show up across relationships, workplaces, families, spiritual spaces, and institutions. We'll explore how confusion is created, how clarity gets disrupted, how influence operates long before anyone feels controlled. Not so you can start spotting danger everywhere, but so you can stop mistaking impact for personal failure. Because once you can see the map, you don't need to argue with the terrain. You can simply orient yourself within it. And that's where we go next, section 2, what this episode and series is and is not. Safety, credibility, nervous system settling. Before we go any further, we need to stabilize the ground beneath this conversation. Not because what we're talking about is fragile, but because the topic itself destabilizes people when it isn't framed carefully. Manipulation, influence, psychological control. These words can activate fear, suspicion, self-doubt, and defensive scanning if they're introduced too quickly or without context. And this work is not meant to be done from a state of threat. So this section exists to slow everything down, to establish boundaries, to remove pressure, and to make it very clear what kind of listening this episode and series requires. Because if we don't do that, the material that follows may be misused, either against others or against yourself. What this episode is not. Let's start by saying what this episode is not, because most harm in this space comes from misunderstanding intent. This episode is not an armchair diagnosis. We are not here to decide what kind of person someone really is. We are not here to retrofit psychological labels onto people from your past. We are not here to conclude that someone was a narcissist, a sociopath, a psychopath, or anything else. Diagnosis requires clinical context, longitudinal assessment, ethical responsibility, and direct engagement with the person being assessed. None of that exists here, and pretending otherwise would be irresponsible. More importantly, diagnosis is not required to understand impact. You don't need a label to know that something harmed you. You don't need a category to recognize that a dynamic eroded your clarity, autonomy, or sense of self. This work deliberately stays upstream of diagnosis, at the level of patterns, mechanisms, and effects, because that's where insight is most useful and least dangerous. This episode is also not demonization of mental illness. This distinction matters deeply. Many of the behaviors people associate with dark psychology overlap with trauma responses, attachment wounds, nervous system adaptations, and survival strategies learned under pressure. Flattening those into moral failure does harm, not only to others, but to our own capacity for compassion and discernment. We are not here to frame psychological struggle as evil. We are not here to imply that distress equals danger. We are not here to strip humanity from people by reducing them to traits. Understanding manipulation does not require dehumanization. In fact, the moment understanding turns into contempt, clarity is already lost. And finally, this episode and series is not encouraging paranoia. This is not about scanning every interaction for threat. It's not about distrusting everyone around you. It's not about withdrawing from connection or assuming hidden agendas. If this material led you to see danger everywhere, it would be doing the opposite of what it's meant to do. Paranoia collapses perception. It narrows attention. It replaces curiosity with suspicion. That's not discernment, that's fear, and fear is not the state from which accurate pattern recognition emerges. What this episode is. So if it's not diagnosis, demonization, or paranoia, what is it? This episode is about pattern recognition over labeling. Labels stop inquiry. Patterns invite understanding. When you label someone, the story closes. When you recognize a pattern, the system opens. Patterns allow us to ask better questions. What tends to happen next? What changes in me over time? What does this dynamic reliably produce? And that's the level we're working at. This episode and series is also grounded in the idea that psychology is not moral judgment. Describing a mechanism does not mean condemning a person. Naming a dynamic does not mean assigning intent. Explaining an effect does not mean declaring someone bad. Psychology used properly is descriptive, not punitive. It helps us understand how human systems behave under certain conditions. Power, insecurity, dependency, fear, status, scarcity. These pressures shape behaviour in predictable ways, often without conscious awareness. Understanding that doesn't excuse harm, but it does prevent us from simplifying complex reality into good versus evil. That matters, especially in a cultural climate that rewards outrage and certainty over nuance and humility. This episode and series holds a clear line around spiritual language. Spiritual language isn't delusion. Many people describe experiences of manipulation, coercion, or psychological intrusion using spiritual metaphors, not because they are irrational, but because the experience bypassed rational processing. When something affects identity, meaning, agency, or existential safety, people reach for symbolic language. That doesn't make the experience unreal. It means it happened at a level that words struggle to reach. This episode will not mock that. It will not dismiss it. And it will not literalize it either. Instead, it will translate. Because spiritual language and psychological language often describe the same phenomenon from different angles, one symbolic, one mechanistic. Holding both without collapsing into fantasy or reductionism is part of the work here. Why this orientation matters? This orientation isn't filler. It's not a disclaimer for legal safety. It's not an intellectual preface. It's nervous system hygiene. When people encounter material about manipulation without this grounding, their systems often react in one of two ways. Some become hyper-alert. They begin reinterpreting every past interaction as malicious. They lose trust not only in others, but in their own capacity to judge accurately. Others collapse inward. They decide they must be naive, foolish, complicit. They internalize blame and shame instead of insight. Neither response leads to clarity. Clarity emerges when the nervous system is regulated enough to stay open, curious, and grounded, able to hold ambiguity without rushing to certainty. That's what this orientation is protecting. It gives you permission to stay present, stay relational, and stay connected to your own signals without turning this episode into a tool for self-attack or social withdrawal. The anchor that holds the series. So let's place the anchor clearly, because everything that follows depends on it. We're not here to label people. We're here to understand patterns that leave predictable damage. This single sentence does a lot of work. It keeps the focus on effects, not identities. It allows compassion without naivety. It makes room for accountability without demonization. Most importantly, it redirects attention away from the question, what kind of person are they? Toward a far more useful one. What is happening to me inside this dynamic? That question doesn't require certainty. It doesn't require accusation, and it doesn't require anyone to be cast as a villain. It simply requires honesty. Honesty, especially the kind that listens to bodily signals before narrative, is where discernment begins. With that orientation in place, we can now move forward safely. Because once the ground is stable, we can begin mapping the terrain, not by naming people, but by understanding mechanisms. Section 3, the map of manipulation, the mechanisms, not the people, building a shared map before naming archetypes. Now that the ground is steady, we can widen the lens, because what you heard in the opening story, the fatigue, the fog, the quiet self-doubt, wasn't an isolated incident. It wasn't a personality clash, and it wasn't a personal weakness. It followed a pattern, Manipulation, in its most common and effective forms, is not a type of person. It's a process. A set of mechanisms that, when present together or repeated over time, reliably produce certain effects in the people exposed to them. These mechanisms show up across relationships, workplaces, families, institutions, spiritual communities, and social systems. They don't require cruelty. They don't require conscious intent. And they don't require anyone to see themselves as manipulative. They simply require certain conditions. This section is about naming those conditions, not as clinical definitions to memorize, but as experiential patterns you may already recognize in your body. As you listen, keep one question lightly in the background. Don't answer it yet. Just notice what it evokes. What changes in me when these patterns repeat? That question will guide us through the map. Manipulation as a process, not a personality. Before we look at individual mechanisms, it's important to clarify what we mean by manipulation in this context. We're not talking about persuasion. We're not talking about disagreement. We're not talking about influence in the ordinary sense of social interaction. We're talking about influence that consistently undermines autonomy. Influence that leaves you less clear, less anchored, and less trusting of your own perception than you were before. Crucially, this can happen without anyone intending harm. Many manipulative dynamics emerge when one person is anxious and needs control, one person is insecure and needs validation, one person is overwhelmed and offloads regulation onto others, or one person has learned, often unconsciously, that certain strategies work. The map we're building here does not assign motive, it describes effects. If the effect is predictable, the pattern matters, regardless of why it's happening. Mechanism 1. Intermittent reinforcement. Warmth leads to withdrawal, and withdrawal leads to warmth. This is one of the most powerful mechanisms in human behavior and one of the least recognized in everyday life. Intermittent reinforcement occurs when positive connection is delivered inconsistently. Warmth, attention, validation, or closeness appears, then disappears, then returns again without clear explanation. Nothing overtly abusive happens. No explicit punishment is applied. The inconsistency itself does the work. When warmth is predictable, your nervous system relaxes. When warmth is unpredictable, your nervous system orients. You pay closer attention, you monitor cues, you try to restore the earlier state. Over time, your focus shifts away from your own internal signals and toward the other person's availability. You begin to track them instead of yourself. This is not weakness, it's biology. Intermittent signals keep systems engaged. They create anticipation, they generate attachment under uncertainty. And because the warmth does return, sometimes the dynamic doesn't feel harmful. It feels meaningful, charged, significant, but the cost is subtle. You become less centered, less able to leave, more invested in restoring what was lost. And because nothing overtly wrong is happening, you don't feel justified in naming the effect. Mechanism 2. Gaslighting, subtle reality erosion. When people hear the word gaslighting, they often imagine overt denial, someone insisting something never happened when it clearly did. That does happen, but far more common is a quieter form. Subtle gaslighting doesn't attack reality directly. It destabilizes confidence in perception. It shows up as small contradictions, shifting narratives, plausible reinterpretations that sound reasonable, explanations that leave you unsure whether you're remembering correctly. Nothing is outrageous enough to confront. Nothing is clear enough to accuse. And because the discrepancies are small, you assume the error must be yours. Did I mishear that? Am I remembering it wrong? Maybe I'm tired. Maybe I misunderstood. Over time, this creates an internal habit. You defer to the other person's version of events, not because you believe them more, but because you trust yourself less. The key here is not deception, it's erosion. Your internal reference point weakens. Your recall feels unreliable. Your confidence in your own sense-making diminishes. And once that happens, influence becomes much easier. Mechanism 3. Projection. Giving you the emotional burden. Projection in manipulative dynamics isn't always dramatic or accusatory. Often, it's quiet and relational. You find yourself holding emotions that don't feel like yours. Guilt that appeared without clear cause. Responsibility you didn't agree to take on. Confusion that seems to live inside you, even though it didn't start there. This happens when emotional material that someone cannot tolerate in themselves is suddenly displaced into the relational space. And you, often unconsciously, pick it up. You start explaining, justifying, reassuring. Not because you did something wrong, but because the atmosphere demands it. Over time, this can invert responsibility. You feel responsible for their mood, their stability, their comfort. And because you're the one carrying the weight, you assume it must belong to you. This is not about blame. It's about noticing where emotional labor consistently accumulates. Mechanism 4. Trauma bonding. Attachment formed under threat. Trauma bonding doesn't require overt abuse. It requires uncertainty combined with emotional intensity. When connection is unpredictable, charged, and interspersed with discomfort or threat, attachment can deepen rather than dissolve. The nervous system learns that relief comes from the same source as distress. The bond feels intense, significant, difficult to leave, and hard to explain to others. It often gets mistaken for depth. But depth that requires you to abandon yourself is not intimacy, it's survival. Trauma bonding works because it bypasses logic. You don't stay because it makes sense. You stay because leaving feels worse, even if you can't articulate why. And again, the key point here is not intent. Trauma bonds form because nervous systems adapt to instability by seeking regulation wherever it appears, even if that source is also destabilizing. Mechanism 5. Status asymmetry. One voice matters more. Status asymmetry exists whenever one person's interpretation consistently outweighs another's. It doesn't require formal authority. It can be emotional, social, intellectual, or spiritual. One person defines what's reasonable, what's true, what's acceptable, what's overthinking. The other person adapts. They soften their language. They second-guess their reactions. They preemptively edit themselves to maintain harmony. This asymmetry often hides behind benevolence, advice, concern, guidance, but the effect is cumulative. Your voice becomes provisional. Their voice becomes definitive. And over time, this quietly restructures the relationship, not through domination, but through deference. Mechanism 6. Information control, partial truth. Time disclosure. Information control doesn't require lying. It works through omission, timing, selective disclosure, and framing. You're given just enough information to stay engaged, but not enough to orient fully. Important details arrive late, or only after decisions are made. Context is withheld until it no longer changes the outcome. This keeps you reactive rather than reflective. You respond to what's in front of you without the full picture. And because each piece of information is individually plausible, you don't feel justified in objecting. But the pattern matters. When you never have the whole map, you can't choose freely. You can only adapt. Mechanism 7. Identity erosion, shrinking to maintain connection. This is often the end result of the other mechanisms operating together. Over time, you notice, you speak less, you explain more, you soften boundaries preemptively, you become less certain of what you want. Not because you've been told to change, but because the relational environment rewards contraction. You become easier, quieter, more agreeable. And because this happens gradually, it doesn't feel like loss. It feels like maturity, compromise, being understanding, but the cost is real. You begin to disappear, not dramatically, but quietly. Why these mechanisms work together. Each of these mechanisms alone can occur in ordinary life. No relationship is perfectly regulated. No interaction is free from asymmetry or misunderstanding. What makes manipulation harmful is repetition and convergence. When several of these mechanisms operate together over time, they reinforce one another. Intermittent reinforcement keeps you engaged. Gaslighting weakens your confidence. Projection burdens you emotionally. Trauma bonding deepens attachment. Status asymmetry limits your voice. Information control restricts orientation. Identity erosion becomes the outcome. None of this requires malice, but the effect is predictable. And that brings us back to the guiding question. What changes in you when these patterns repeat? Not what label fits the other person. Not what story explains their behaviour. But what happens inside you, because that's where discernment lives. If this section resonates, it's important to hold it gently. This is not a checklist. It's not a diagnostic tool. It's not a reason to rewrite your past with certainty. It's a map, and maps don't tell you where to go. They help you understand where you are. In the next section, we'll ground this further, not by adding more theory, but by looking at how these mechanisms show up in everyday contexts most people would never describe as manipulative. Relationships, workplaces, spiritual or personal growth spaces, places where harm often hides precisely because it looks like care. Section 4, real-life scenarios where this actually shows up, grounding the map in collective, everyday reality. Up to this point, everything we've explored has been internal. Sensations, signals, patterns unfolding quietly inside a person. But one of the most important things to understand about manipulation is that it does not live only in intimate relationships. In fact, some of the most enduring and least recognized forms of manipulation occur in collective environments, places where responsibility is diffuse, roles are formalized, and harm hides behind structure. This section exists to do one thing: to show how the mechanisms we've mapped operate in settings that look normal, professional, even supportive on the surface. No villains, no diagnoses, no personal narratives. Just dynamics, because if manipulation only existed in extreme or intimate contexts, it would be easy to spot. But it doesn't. It often thrives in environments that explicitly claim to value care, growth, or collaboration. Let's begin there. Scenario 1. The supportive workplace that slowly silences. Imagine a work environment that prides itself on being progressive, caring, and people-focused. There are open plan offices, weekly check-ins, language around well-being, psychological safety, and teamwork. On paper, it looks healthy. On the surface, it feels supportive. At first, feedback is warm and encouraging. Employees are praised for being flexible, adaptable, and committed. There's a strong emphasis on pulling together and supporting the mission. This is where intermittent reinforcement quietly enters. Positive feedback arrives, but unpredictably. Praise is given publicly, while concerns are handled privately and vaguely. One week, someone's initiative is celebrated. The next, the same behaviour is framed as overstepping. No rules have changed, but the interpretation has. People begin to watch the emotional weather rather than the written policy. They learn to read tone, timing, mood. Not because they're manipulative, but because the environment has made attunement necessary. Now add statusymmetry. Decision-making power is concentrated in a small leadership group. They frame themselves as approachable, open, and caring. But when concerns are raised, the response subtly redirects responsibility. You might be taking this personally. That wasn't the intention. We all need to be resilient. These statements sound reasonable, even supportive. But over time, they shift the burden of adjustment downward. The system doesn't change. The individual does. Employees learn which concerns are welcomed and which quietly stall careers. Not through threats, but through patterns. Those who adapt are described as team players. Those who persist are described as difficult, negative, or not aligned with culture. This is where information control emerges. Strategic decisions are communicated late. Context arrives after implementation. Employees are asked to respond quickly, without the full picture. When outcomes are questioned, they're told the decision was complex, nuanced, or constrained by factors they weren't aware of. Which is true, but incomplete, because consistently withholding context removes meaningful consent. People can't disagree with what they were never fully shown. Over time, something shifts. People stop raising questions. Meetings become quieter. Innovation gives way to compliance. Not because everyone agrees, but because the cost of dissent feels too high, even if it's never explicitly stated. What's happening here is not individual malice. It's a system that rewards contraction. And the impact on individuals is predictable. They doubt their perceptions. They soften language preemptively. They internalize frustration as personal inadequacy. This is manipulation without manipulators, a collective dynamic where mechanisms operate through structure rather than intent. Scenario 2, the collective that frames control as care. Now let's move into a different kind of collective environment, one organized around shared values, growth, or purpose. This could be a professional community, a training organization, a movement, or any group built around an ideal: healing, transformation, innovation, awakening, progress. These spaces often attract people who are conscientious, reflective, and open. People who want to grow. People who care about integrity. At first, the environment feels validating. There's shared language, shared goals, a sense of belonging. Members are encouraged to be vulnerable, to reflect, to do the work. This can be genuinely supportive, and often is at the beginning. But here's where subtle status asymmetry can form. Certain voices begin to carry more weight. Not because of formal authority, but because of perceived insight, experience, or moral clarity. Their interpretations become reference points. Their language sets the tone. Disagreement is allowed, but only within bounds. Questions that align with the group's framework are welcomed. Questions that challenge the framework itself are reframed. You're resisting the process. That's your ego talking. You're not ready to see this yet. Notice what happens here. The concern isn't addressed. The framework isn't examined. The focus turns inward onto the person raising the question. This is projection at the collective level. Discomfort generated by the system is returned to the individual as a personal issue. Confusion becomes a sign of immaturity. Doubt becomes a lack of commitment. And because the language is moralized, framed around growth, healing, or consciousness, it carries weight. People don't want to be seen as defensive, or unconscious, or blocking their own development, so they adapt. They reinterpret their discomfort as resistance. They override their instincts in the name of progress. They stay silent when something feels wrong. This is where trauma bonding can quietly form. Attachment deepens not because the environment feels safe, but because leaving feels like failure, or regression, or loss of identity. The group becomes the container for meaning, belonging, and validation, even as it undermines autonomy. And again, nothing overtly abusive happens. There are no threats, no punishments, no explicit commands, just a slow narrowing of acceptable perception. Scenario 3, the meeting where reality is softly rewritten. Let's return briefly to the workplace, but zoom in on a single familiar moment, a meeting. An issue is raised. Perhaps a process isn't working. Perhaps a decision had unintended consequences. The concern is expressed calmly, professionally, with evidence. The response comes quickly. That's not how it was intended. I think there's been a misunderstanding. We've looked at this carefully. No one says the concern is wrong, but it isn't engaged either. Instead, the reality of the situation is gently reframed. Context is added selectively, complexity is emphasized, responsibility is diffused. By the end of the meeting, nothing has changed except the person who spoke. They feel exposed, unsure, over-articulated. They replay the exchange afterwards, trying to understand why it felt so destabilizing. Nothing hostile was said. No one raised their voice. And yet, the experience lingered. This is subtle gaslighting at the systemic level. Not denial of facts, but erosion of confidence in raising them. Over time, people learn. They learn which topics lead to deflection, which questions produce vague reassurance instead of action, which concerns quietly stall momentum, and eventually they stop asking. Not because they've been convinced, but because the environment has taught them that clarity is unwelcome. What these scenarios have in common, across these examples, workplace, collective, meeting, the same mechanisms appear. Intermittent reinforcement keeps people engaged. Gaslighting erodes confidence in perception. Projection shifts discomfort onto individuals. Trauma bonding deepens attachment under uncertainty. Status asymmetry privileges certain voices. Information control limits orientation. Identity erosion becomes the adaptation. And in every case, the damage is quiet. People don't leave in outrage. They leave exhausted, or numb, or blaming themselves. Or they don't leave at all. They simply become smaller inside the system. That's why these dynamics are so difficult to name. They don't look like abuse. They look like professionalism, or care, or growth. But the test is simple, even if it's uncomfortable. Who has to adapt consistently? Who carries the confusion? Who leaves interactions feeling diminished? Those questions cut through surface narratives. Why collective contexts are so powerful. Collective environments amplify manipulation because they diffuse responsibility. No single person feels accountable. No single action feels decisive. Everything is explained as culture, process, or necessity. And because belonging is at stake, employment, identity, community, people tolerate far more ambiguity than they would in isolated interactions. They stay longer. They rationalize more. They doubt themselves more deeply. This is not a failure of intelligence or strength. It's what human nervous systems do when connection and survival are linked. Holding this without paranoia, it's important to pause here. This section is not meant to make you suspicious of every workplace or group. Most environments contain a mix of healthy and unhealthy dynamics. Not every instance of deflection is manipulation. Not every hierarchy is abusive. The point is not to diagnose systems. It's to notice effects, to observe what consistently happens to people over time within a given context. Do they become clearer or more confused? More autonomous or more deferential? More expressive or more guarded? Those trends matter more than intent, leading forward. Now that we've grounded these mechanisms in collective reality, we can return to the body. Because whether manipulation happens in a relationship or a workplace, the nervous system responds in the same way. Confusion is not random. It's not personal failure. It's a physiological response to subtle, ongoing pressure. In the next section, we'll explore that directly and begin reframing confusion not as weakness, but as signal. Section 5, The Body Knows, Why Confusion is a Signal. Reframing self-blame into physiology. Up to this point, we've been careful not to rush. We've mapped patterns. We've grounded them in collective reality. And now we arrive at the layer that quietly explains everything that came before, the body. Because regardless of where manipulation shows up, a workplace, a collective, a relationship, an institution, it is processed first and foremost as physiology. Long before language, long before interpretation, long before you decide what you think about what's happening, your nervous system has already made an assessment. Safe or not safe, approach or withdraw, engage or conserve. And when that assessment is repeatedly challenged, not by overt danger, but by subtle, ongoing pressure, the result is often something people don't recognize as a signal at all. Confusion. This section exists to correct a widespread misunderstanding. That confusion means you're not thinking clearly enough, that you need more information, that you need to get perspective. Often, the opposite is true. Confusion is not a failure of intelligence. It's a state shift. The nervous system doesn't argue. It responds. The nervous system does not debate. It does not weigh pros and cons. It does not wait for evidence in the way the thinking mind does. It tracks patterns, tone timing, consistency, reciprocity, predictability. When these elements align, the system settles. When they don't, it adjusts. And crucially, it adjusts before you have words for what's happening. This is why people often say things like, I don't know why, but something feels off. I can't put my finger on it. Nothing bad happened, but I feel strange. What they're describing isn't intuition in a mystical sense. It's neuroception, the body's capacity to detect safety or threat without conscious reasoning. And here's the important part. Subtle manipulation doesn't register as acute danger. It registers as ambiguous threat. Ambiguity is far harder on the nervous system than clarity. When threat is clear, the system mobilizes. When safety is clear, the system relaxes. But when signals are mixed, warmth paired with withdrawal, care paired with control, validation paired with erosion, the system can't resolve the state. That unresolved state is what many people experience as confusion. Why logic fails under subtle pressure, a common response to confusion is to try to think harder. People analyze conversations. They replay meetings. They gather more information. They look for the sentence they missed or the detail that will make everything make sense. But when confusion is driven by nervous system state, more cognition doesn't restore clarity. In fact, it often makes things worse. Why? Because under subtle, ongoing pressure, the nervous system prioritizes relationship preservation over abstract reasoning, especially in environments where connection is tied to survival, employment, belonging, identity, meaning. This is where freeze and fawn responses quietly enter. Freeze and fawn, as relational survival strategies, freeze and fawn are often misunderstood because they don't look dramatic. There's no panic, no flight, no fight. Instead, there's hesitation, compliance, over-explaining, self-editing, and emotional numbing. Freeze is what happens when the system detects threat but sees no viable escape. It conserves energy. It reduces expression. It narrows focus. Fawn is what happens when the system learns that appeasement restores stability. It prioritizes harmony. It anticipates needs. It smooths tension before it escalates. Neither response is weakness. They are adaptations. They keep people employed. They keep groups intact. They keep conflict from erupting. But they come at a cost. When freeze or fawn become chronic, clarity suffers. Not because the person lacks insight, but because the nervous system is operating in management mode rather than exploration. And management mode is not where truth emerges. Confusion as an adaptive state. This is the reframing that changes everything. Confusion is not random. It's not personal failure. It's not a lack of intelligence. Confusion is often the most honest response to an environment that sends mixed signals. When words say one thing, tone says another, outcomes contradict promises, and questioning leads to subtle penalties, the nervous system has no stable reference point. So it suspends certainty. It keeps you from committing fully in any direction. This suspension feels uncomfortable, even distressing, but it serves a function. It prevents premature conclusions in an unstable environment. In other words, confusion can be protective. The problem arises when people interpret that protective state as incompetence and push themselves out of it prematurely by overriding their signals, rationalizing the environment, or blaming themselves. That's when damage deepens, why confusion often gets moralized. In many cultures and organizations, clarity is equated with competence. Being decisive is praised, hesitation is pathologized, uncertainty is framed as weakness. So when someone feels confused, they don't just feel disoriented, they feel deficient. They assume they're not seeing clearly enough, they're not strong enough, they're not resilient enough. This moralization compounds the problem. Instead of asking, what is my body responding to? They ask, what's wrong with me? And that question quietly aligns them with the very dynamics that produced the confusion in the first place. Subtle pressure and the collapse of coherence. One of the clearest signs that confusion is physiological rather than intellectual is this. People often regain clarity after distance, not after explanation. When they step away from the environment, take leave, change teams, leave a group, their thinking sharpens. Memory returns, events resequence themselves. They say things like, now that I'm out, I can see it. I couldn't think clearly when I was inside it. Everything feels obvious in hindsight. This isn't because they suddenly became smarter. It's because their nervous system exited a prolonged state of ambiguous threat. Clarity returns when the system feels safe enough to integrate information again. That alone tells us confusion was never a cognitive defect. It was a contextual response. The cost of ignoring bodily signals. When people ignore confusion and push through it, several things tend to happen over time. They become more compliant. They defer more often. They lose access to spontaneous thought. They rely increasingly on external validation. Not because they want to, but because their system has learned that internal signals are unreliable or unsafe to follow. This is how identity erosion actually happens. Not through overt domination, but through the repeated overriding of one's own physiological cues. Each time someone tells themselves, it's probably nothing, I'm just tired, I shouldn't make a fuss, they train their system to distrust itself. And once that trust erodes, influence becomes far easier. Why this matters, before we talk about language, everything in the next section, about tone, phrasing, moral ambiguity, and linguistic influence, rests on this foundation. Language does not bypass cognition by magic. It bypasses cognition because the nervous system is already managing threat. Words land differently in a body that's settled than in a body that's bracing. The same sentence can feel supportive or controlling depending on state. The same question can feel curious or invasive, which means the real work is not learning what to say, it's learning when your body has shifted, because that shift determines how meaning is received, reorienting to the body without over-interpreting. At this point, it's important to make something very clear. Listening to the body does not mean treating every discomfort as danger, interpreting every contraction as manipulation, or acting on sensation alone. This is not about reacting, it's about registering. There is a difference between noticing a signal and making a story out of it. This section is not asking you to conclude anything. It's asking you to stop dismissing what's already there, to acknowledge that confusion has a cause, even if you don't yet know what it is. Confusion isn't a failure of intelligence, it's a state shift, a shift into management, a shift into conservation, a shift into adaptation. Once you see confusion this way, self-blame loses its grip. You stop asking why you couldn't think clearly and start asking what your system was responding to. And that question opens the door to discernment without paranoia. Now that we've re-established the body as a valid source of information, we can examine the next mechanism of influence more precisely. Because manipulation doesn't rely on force. It relies on language, not dramatic language, not obvious commands, but phrases that sound reasonable, questions that sound caring, statements that feel safe while quietly shaping behavior. In the next section, we'll explore how words function as nervous system input and why certain forms of language consistently bypass conscious resistance. Section 6, Language as Influence. How words bypass cognition in physical and digital spaces. Up to now, we've been working with something foundational. The body registers first. Confusion, contraction, fatigue, hesitation, these aren't character flaws or cognitive failures. They're physiological responses to environments where signals don't align. And once the nervous system shifts into management mode, something important changes in how information is processed. This is where language enters, because manipulation does not usually rely on force, threat, or explicit instruction. It relies on how meaning is delivered, when it lands, what state it lands in, and how much room it leaves for internal response. Language doesn't just communicate ideas. It regulates nervous systems. And in modern life, that regulation happens as often through screens as it does face-to-face. Language is nervous system input, not information. We're taught to think of language as informational. Words convey facts, sentences express ideas. Meaning is something we interpret consciously. But that's only part of the picture. Before words are interpreted cognitively, they are received somatically. Tone, cadence, pacing, moral framing, implied consequence. These elements are processed faster than conscious thought. They land directly in the nervous system, shaping whether the body opens, contracts, complies, resists, or freezes. This is why two sentences with identical content can feel completely different depending on how they're delivered. And it's why manipulation so often hides in language that sounds reasonable, caring, or neutral. Not because the words are false, but because they shape behavior without inviting agency. Tone versus content, where influence actually lives. One of the most common misunderstandings about manipulation is the belief that it lives in what is said. In reality, it lives in the relationship between tone and content. A sentence can be factually benign and still exert control. For example, I'm only saying this because I care. On the surface, this sounds kind, even protective, but notice what it does. It pre-frames the interaction morally. It positions disagreement as ingratitude. It implies that resistance equals rejection of care. The content may be neutral. The tone collapses choice. Now consider this. You're overthinking. Just trust me. Again, the words aren't aggressive. But the effect is immediate. Your perception is subtly downgraded. Their perspective is elevated. Your internal signal is reframed as a flaw. No argument is required. No dominance is declared. Compliance happens quietly, if it happens at all. This is why people often struggle to explain why certain conversations feel wrong. There's nothing to point to. No insult. No threat, just a subtle pressure to defer. Moralized language, control disguised as care. One of the most effective ways language bypasses cognition is through moral framing. When a statement is framed as caring, ethical, or protective, the nervous system treats it differently. Questioning it feels risky, not because of consequences, but because of identity. If you push back, what does that make you? Uncaring, selfish, defensive, or immature? This is how language regulates behavior without instruction. Consider phrases like, "This is for your own good." "I'm just trying to help." "You'll understand later." People who've done the work don't react like that. Each of these statements narrows the space for response. They don't invite dialogue, they invite submission. And because the framing is moral rather than authoritarian, resistance feels inappropriate, even when something inside you says no. Questions that remove agency, while sounding kind. Not all manipulative language comes in the form of statements. Some of the most powerful influence is exerted through questions. Questions are usually associated with openness, curiosity, but not all questions invite choice. Some questions function as behavioral constraints. For example, "Don't you think you're being a bit sensitive? Why would you react like that? What are you afraid of here?" These questions don't seek information. They assign a problem. The focus shifts away from the situation and onto your internal state. You're no longer evaluating the dynamic, you're defending your legitimacy within it. This is particularly potent in environments that value reflection, growth, or emotional intelligence. The more self-aware someone is, the more vulnerable they are to questions that subtly undermine self-trust. You start analysing yourself instead of the system. And that's the point. Digital language, influence without presence. Now we need to widen the frame, because in modern life, much of this influence doesn't happen in rooms, meetings, or conversations. It happens digitally, through emails, through messaging apps, through social media, through platform design. And the absence of physical presence does not reduce the impact. In many cases, it intensifies it. Digital language strips away context, tone of voice, facial expression, pacing, while amplifying interpretation. The nervous system fills in the gaps. This makes digital environments particularly effective at shaping perception. The email that quietly shifts power. Consider a common workplace example. An email arrives late in the day. It's polite, carefully worded. It contains phrases like, just looping you in. As discussed, we've decided to move forward with. The decision has already been made. Your inclusion is symbolic. Your response is constrained. Your consent is assumed. Nothing hostile is present. But the timing, phrasing, and structure communicate something clearly to the nervous system. This is not a conversation. Over time, repeated exposure to this pattern trains people not to engage critically. They respond quickly. They adapt. They stop questioning, not because they agree, but because the format discourages agency. Social media, algorithmic tone-shaping social platforms don't just transmit language, they shape it. Algorithms reward certainty, emotion, and moral clarity. Nuance performs poorly. Hesitation is invisible. Ambiguity doesn't spread. This creates an environment where language becomes sharper, more polarized, more absolute. Statements framed as, everyone knows. If you don't see this, you're blind. Only an idiot would disagree. These aren't arguments. They're status signals. They communicate belonging or exclusion, safety or threat. And because social identity is at stake, the nervous system responds quickly. People align, retreat, or attack, often without conscious reflection. This is manipulation at scale, not by individuals, but by systems that reward certain linguistic forms. Digital gaslighting. When reality is softened, not denied, gaslighting in digital environments rarely looks like outright denial. It looks like selective moderation, shadow banning, content removal without explanation, fact checks that frame interpretation rather than falsity. The effect is subtle. People begin to doubt not a specific fact, but the legitimacy of their perception. They self-censor. They second-guess what they're allowed to notice or say. And because the system presents itself as neutral, automated, objective, procedural, resistance feels futile. This is not conspiracy, it's design. And it has a direct effect on how language is internalized. User interface language and behavioral control beyond content. Platforms use interface language to shape behavior. Buttons that say, "Are you sure you want to leave? You might miss out." People like you usually choose. These are not neutral prompts, they're nudges. They bypass deliberation by appealing to fear of loss, belonging, or conformity. And because they're embedded in design, people rarely question them. The language blends into function, but the nervous system still registers the pressure. Why digital influence feels so disorienting. Digital environments remove one crucial stabilizer, reciprocity. In physical conversation, you can feel pacing, you can interrupt, you can read signals. Online, language arrives unidirectionally, often asynchronously, without immediate feedback. This makes it easier for influence to feel ambient rather than interpersonal. You don't feel controlled, you feel shaped. Preferences shift, opinions harden, attention narrows. And because this happens gradually, without a clear agent, people internalize the effects. They believe they arrived at conclusions independently, even when those conclusions were guided. Language, safety, and compliance. Whether in person or digital, language exerts its strongest influence when the nervous system is already unsettled. Fatigue, uncertainty, social pressure, economic dependence. In these states, people don't resist. They comply quietly. They choose the path of least friction. They align with dominant narratives. They silence doubts that feel inconvenient. This isn't failure, it's adaptation. Language doesn't need to convince you. It only needs to reduce your capacity to object. Why awareness alone isn't enough. At this point, it's tempting to think that recognizing manipulative language is the solution. It isn't. People can recognize patterns intellectually and still be influenced by them, because influence doesn't operate primarily at the level of thought. It operates at the level of state. If your nervous system is braced, tired, or dependent, even the clearest insight won't fully protect you. That's why this work keeps returning to the body. Language only bypasses cognition when cognition is already compromised by state. Holding language without hypervigilance. One important clarification before we move on. Not all moral language is manipulative. Not all reassurance is control. Not all guidance removes agency. The difference isn't in the words alone. It's in the effect over time. Does the language expand your capacity to choose or narrow it? Does it invite reflection or demand alignment? Does it increase clarity or create dependence? Those questions matter more than any phrase ever will. Bringing the linguaverse into focus. This is where the linguaverse concept becomes essential. Language is not just symbolic, it's regulatory. It modulates nervous systems, shapes perception, and scaffolds reality, especially in environments where physical cues are absent or reduced. Understanding this doesn't require paranoia, it requires literacy, the ability to notice when words collapse choice, assign internal fault, moralize compliance, or subtly reposition authority, not to react but to orient, leading into the next section. At this point in the episode, several layers are now aligned. Patterns of manipulation, collective dynamics, nervous system state, linguistic influence. What remains is to place all of this within a wider conceptual frame without turning it into diagnosis, because there are recurring strategies that cluster together. And there are well-documented trait groupings that describe them, but they are maps, not verdicts. In the next section, we'll introduce that framework carefully, not to label people, but to orient strategies along a spectrum of influence. Section 7, naming the framework without diagnosing, orienting with research, debates, and the limits of knowing motives. Before we move into anything like types, I want to name the tension that sits at the center of this entire topic. People want names. Not because they're lazy, but because naming brings relief. When something has a label, it feels contained. It feels explainable. It feels less like chaos. If you've ever been destabilized by manipulation, whether it happened in a relationship, a workplace, a community, or online, you'll recognize the craving for a coherent story. What was that? What kind of person does that? Was it intentional? Were they aware? Was I naive? So yes, frameworks matter. But here's the problem. Frameworks can become cages. They can turn living dynamics into fixed identities. They can flatten complexity into good people and bad people. They can create the illusion that once you name the thing, you fully understand it. And that's where paranoia and projection start to creep in. So in this section, we're going to do something more disciplined. We're going to name a framework, but we're going to treat it as a map, not a verdict. We're going to acknowledge what research can help us with, and we're also going to acknowledge what research cannot give us. Because the uncomfortable truth is this: we will probably never fully know another person's motives, not with certainty, not from the outside, sometimes not even when they tell us. And yet we still have to live in the world. We still have to make choices. We still have to protect our clarity, autonomy, and dignity. So the question becomes, how do we understand harmful patterns without turning understanding into ideology? That's what this section is for, why we use trait frameworks at all. When you don't have a framework, you blame yourself. When you don't understand mechanisms, you personalize outcomes. You assume you're weak, stupid, too sensitive, too trusting, too broken. A framework can interrupt that self-blame by showing that many harmful dynamics are predictable, that they have structure, that they repeat across contexts because they're built on recurring strategies: dominance, impression management, exploitation, coercion, emotional burden shifting. Research frameworks are useful here because they pull us away from myth. They help us say, this isn't mystical. This isn't just bad vibes. This is a recognizable pattern of social behavior. But we have to be careful about what frameworks are designed to do. Some frameworks exist to support clinical work. Some exist for forensic risk assessment. Some are research constructs. Some are pop psychology simplifications. If we mix those together carelessly, we get exactly what we're trying to avoid: armchair diagnosis and moral panic. So here's the line we're holding. We're going to talk about clusters of traits and strategies that researchers have studied, but we're going to keep our focus on patterns and impacts, not identities and accusations. The dark triad as a reference frame, not a weapon. The dark triad is one of the most well-known modern clustering concepts. It groups 3 socially aversive trait patterns that often overlap: narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. It's used widely in research as a shorthand for certain interpersonal styles that can be exploitative or harmful. But even in academic circles, there's debate about how much this triad adds beyond other constructs, particularly psychopathy, and how distinct these traits really are in practice. So think of the dark triad like this. It's a lens on certain strategies of social behavior, especially those involving self-centeredness, callousness, deception, and manipulation, but it's not a diagnostic tool, and it's not a moral category. Now, why bring it in at all? Because even with its limitations, it gives us language for reality many people have lived. Some individuals and some systems reliably use: charm without conscience, empathy as leverage, truth as a tool rather than a commitment, and connection as a means of control. But the moment you turn the dark triad into a sorting machine for human beings, You're this, you're that. You've left discernment and entered ideology. And ideology is exactly the mental state manipulation thrives in. So we use the dark triad sparingly as a reference for strategies, not a label for souls. Psychopathy and the push toward better models. Now, psychopathy is probably the most loaded word in this space, and for good reason. In the public imagination, it becomes a monster category. In legal context, it becomes dangerous. In pop psychology, it becomes a trending insult. But in research, it's been debated for decades. What exactly is psychopathy? How is it measured? How does it relate to antisocial personality disorder? And how much of it is about behaviour versus personality style? One of the most influential measurement tools has been Hare's Psychopathy Checklist, revised PCLR. It's widely used in forensic contexts, and even its creator has discussed issues of misuse when applied improperly. At the same time, there have been significant debates, including concerns raised about how the PCLR is used in high-stakes legal settings, for example, in capital sentencing risk assessments, and counter-responses, debating what the evidence supports. Why does that matter for this podcast? Because it tells us something important. Even in professional settings, these labels are not settled facts. They are contested constructs being refined over time with real-world consequences when misapplied. So rather than treating psychopath as a definitive category, many researchers use more nuanced models. A key example is the triarchic model of psychopathy, which conceptualizes psychopathy as involving three phenotypic constructs. Disinhibition defined as impulse control problems and irresponsibility. Meanness defined as callousness, lack of empathy, and exploitative aggression. Boldness defined as social dominance, fearlessness, and emotional resiliency. Notice what this does. It breaks a monster label into components that can appear in different combinations and that can overlap in some forms with socially rewarded traits like boldness, depending on context. That alone should humble us. It means someone can look confident and charismatic and still be deeply unsafe, but it also means not all confidence is predatory and not all boldness is pathology. Frameworks help us differentiate. Reclassification trends, from types to dimensions. Now we come to one of the most important developments in modern personality research and diagnosis, the move away from rigid types toward dimensional models. In other words, instead of saying, this person has X disorder, newer models increasingly focus on severity of personality dysfunction and trait domain specifiers. For example, the ICD-11 classification of personality disorder is a major shift toward a dimensional approach, focusing on severity and trait domains, rather than many distinct categorical personality disorder types. Discussions of how ICD-11 trait domains relate to older categories, including dissociality, reflect this transition. Why does that matter here? Because it supports the exact stance we've been taking throughout the episode. These patterns exist on spectra. People can show traits without being a type. Systems can reward traits without anyone being evil. And harm can be real even when nobody fits a clean category. This shift is also a warning. If professional diagnostic systems are moving away from rigid personality boxes, we should be cautious about using rigid boxes in everyday discourse, especially online, where language becomes weaponized fast. The philosophical problem. Can we ever know motive? Now let's step out of psychology for a moment and into philosophy, because this question sits under everything we're doing. Will we ever fully understand another person's motives? In philosophy of mind and ethics, motive is slippery. There are multiple reasons for that. 1. People don't have full access to their own motives. Much human behavior is driven by unconscious adaptation, fear, shame, status threat, attachment insecurity, conditioned reward. 2. People can rationalize after the fact. They produce narratives that make behavior sound coherent and moral, even if the behavior was impulsive, strategic, or defensive. 3. Words are not a transparent window into intent. Especially in manipulative dynamics, language is often used to manage perception rather than reveal truth. So the philosophical caution is this: if you anchor your discernment to motive, you'll always be vulnerable to doubt, because motive is the one thing you can rarely prove. That's why we anchor discernment to impact and pattern. What happens repeatedly? What changes in you over time? Does the dynamic expand your agency or narrow it? Does it invite clarity or produce fog? This approach doesn't require mind reading. It requires observation, and that's far more stable. Cult dynamics, when frameworks become reality machines. Now we need to connect this to cult behavior, because cult dynamics are where motive becomes almost impossible to pass, and where patterns become undeniable. In cultic systems, and cultic doesn't always mean a formal cult. It can be any coercive collective. Control is often exerted through information control, selective exposure, reframing, discouraging outside sources, status asymmetry. The leader or inner circle defines truth moralized language. Dissent framed as impurity, ego, weakness, betrayal, identity erosion. Individual perception replaced by group narrative intermittent reinforcement. acceptance and warmth conditional on compliance. Notice something. That list is almost identical to our manipulation map, which tells us that cult dynamics are not mystical events. They are social systems built from recurring mechanisms. Now here's where it gets philosophically interesting. In cultic environments, many participants are not consciously malicious. They may genuinely believe they're helping. They may be acting out of fear. They may be seeking meaning. They may be rewarded for compliance and punished for questioning. So if you try to explain cult dynamics purely through bad motives, you miss the machine. But if you explain cult dynamics purely through systems, you risk excusing the harm. So we hold a both, and systems shape people. People still have responsibility. And if you've ever been inside a coercive group, workplace, movement, spiritual space, online subculture, you'll know how important this is. Because the real injury often isn't just what happened. It's the way the group trained you to distrust yourself. Skeptics and proponents, two necessary camps. In any serious discussion of dark personality traits and manipulation, you'll find two camps, and both are needed. The proponents, or realists, they argue that these traits are observable and measurable, imperfectly, but meaningfully. Certain patterns predict harm, and society underestimates strategic exploitation. They point to decades of research on psychopathy models and measurement tools, and to trait frameworks like the triarchic model that aim to improve conceptual clarity. The skeptics or critics, they argue that constructs can be overextended, measures can be misused, especially legally, and dark labels can become self-fulfilling stories that reduce complex humans to stereotypes. They question incremental validity and the utility of certain cluster models, and they critique how some measures function in high-stakes contexts. Here's the important thing. You don't have to pick a camp. You take what's useful from both. From proponents, pattern recognition, realistic caution, respect for harm. From skeptics, humility, anti-stigma, resistance to moral panic and misuse. That combination is discernment. Advantages of understanding these frameworks. Let's name the benefits clearly. 1. You stop personalizing the impact. A map helps you understand that confusion and erosion can be produced by mechanisms, not your inadequacy. 2. You recognize coercion earlier. Not with paranoia, but with literacy. You notice when choice is collapsing. 3. You recover epistemic trust. You learn to respect your perception again, especially when the environment trains you to doubt it. 4. You can navigate collectives more intelligently. You recognize when a workplace or group rewards compliance at the expense of clarity. 5. You reduce your vulnerability to cultic capture, because cultic systems don't start with chains. They start with language, belonging, and moral framing. Disadvantages and risks. Now the shadow side, because this knowledge can harm if held incorrectly. 1. Overlabeling becomes a defense mechanism. People start diagnosing others as a way to avoid vulnerability or complexity. 2. You can become hypervigilant. Seeing manipulation everywhere collapses the nervous system into threat scanning, which ironically makes you easier to influence. 3. Moral inflation happens fast. Dark becomes synonymous with evil, which reduces nuance and fuels dehumanization. 4. False certainty replaces lived observation. People stop asking, "What is happening?" and start declaring, "I know what you are." 5. The framework becomes identity. Some people unconsciously adopt the role of survivor of narcissists as a stable self-concept, which can freeze growth and trap perception in a single narrative. So we keep returning to the anchor. This is about patterns that leave predictable damage, not labels that replace thinking. Where this leaves us. So here's where we land, with both science and philosophy in view. Trait frameworks are useful as maps. Diagnostic categories are contested and evolving, often shifting toward dimensional models. Measures and labels can be helpful or harmful depending on context and use. Motive is inherently difficult to know with certainty. Impact and pattern are more reliable anchors than mind reading. Cult dynamics demonstrate how these mechanisms scale collectively, which brings us right back to what we're doing in this episode. We're not trying to become prosecutors. We're trying to become observers, because the moment you become fluent in pattern recognition without collapsing into accusation, you gain something rare, the ability to stay open-hearted and clear. That's the line, and it's the line most people never get taught. Now that we've named a framework without turning it into diagnosis, we can translate this knowledge into something practical. Not a technique, not a confrontation script, not a checklist, a practice of observation, a way to notice in real time when your body contracts, when your speech shortens, when your perception begins to self-edit, because the goal is not to win arguments. It's to recognize the exact moment you start disappearing and to pause there. Next, we move into Section 8, Observation Practice, Signal Before Meaning, learning to notice without fixing, interpreting, or diagnosing. Up to this point, everything in this episode has been about orientation, not about action, not about confrontation, not about protection strategies or exit plans. Orientation, Because before you can decide what to do in any relational or collective dynamic, you need to know where you are internally, physiologically, perceptually. This section is not a technique. It is not an exercise. It is not a protocol. It's a practice of noticing, and just as importantly, a practice of not rushing to make sense of what you notice. That distinction matters more than it sounds. Why observation comes before meaning? Most people think discernment begins with interpretation. What does this mean? Is this manipulation? Is this unsafe? What kind of person is this? But interpretation is the second step, not the first. The first step is registration. Your nervous system is already registering far more than you consciously track. Tone shifts, pacing changes, power dynamics, inconsistencies, emotional pressure. These are processed continuously, whether or not you're aware of them. The problem isn't that people don't perceive signals. The problem is that they override them immediately. They jump straight to explanation. They rationalize, they textualize, they minimize. And in doing so, they lose access to the most reliable information they have, what actually changed inside them during the interaction. So this practice is about slowing that moment down, not to judge it, not to amplify it, but to let it register without being collapsed into story. Signal before meaning. Let's clarify this phrase because it's central. Signal is what happens in the body. Meaning is the story the mind tells about it. Signal might look like a tightening in the chest, a drop in energy, a sudden urge to appease, a hesitation before speaking, a subtle sense of shrinking. Meaning might sound like, I'm being unreasonable. They didn't mean it like that. I shouldn't make a fuss. I'm probably overreacting. Meaning often arrives fast, and it often arrives to protect the relationship, not to protect truth. Signal arrives first, meaning rushes in to manage it. This practice is about letting signal exist without immediately converting it into explanation. Why we rush to explain. It's worth understanding why people interpret so quickly. Interpretation restores control. If you can explain something, you feel oriented. You feel less vulnerable. You feel like you're back in charge of your internal world. But when explanation is premature, it doesn't restore clarity, it overwrites information. You explain away discomfort before you understand what produced it. And because many environments subtly reward compliance and emotional self-management, people learn early on that noticing too much is risky. So they interpret fast. They smooth things over internally. They become reasonable. They adapt. This practice interrupts that reflex, gently, without force. What this practice is not. Let's be very explicit, because this is where people often go wrong. This practice is not about scanning for danger, hyper-analyzing interactions, assigning labels, preparing confrontations, or deciding what someone's intentions are. It is also not about trusting every sensation blindly, treating discomfort as proof, or using bodily signals as justification for immediate action. Observation is not reaction. Observation is presence. The 3 signals to notice. For this practice, we're keeping it deliberately simple. There are 3 signals to notice, not because they are the only ones, but because they are common, accessible, and highly informative. 1. When your body contracts. This might be physical or subtle. Your shoulders tighten, your breath shortens, your jaw clenches, your stomach drops. Or it might be less obvious, a sense of pulling back, a quiet urge to withdraw, a feeling of bracing. You're not asking why this happens. You're just noticing that it happens. And just as importantly, when it happens. During which sentence? After which tone shift? At what moment in the interaction? No interpretation required. 2. When your speech shortens or changes. Pay attention to what happens to your voice and language. Do you speak less, soften your words, over-explain, preemptively justify? Switch to agreement language? This is not about judging yourself. Speech adaptation is one of the most reliable indicators that a power shift has occurred, often before the mind registers it. You don't need to know whether the shift was real or intentional. The fact that your system adapted is the data. 3. When you second-guess a perception. This is the most subtle and often the most important. You notice something, an inconsistency, a discomfort, a mismatch, and almost immediately you invalidate it. I'm probably tired. I'm reading too much into it. It's not a big deal. This reflex is deeply conditioned. It's often learned in environments where questioning was discouraged, punished, or reframed as personal flaw. Noticing the moment of override is critical. Not to stop it, just to see it. The only rules. There are only 3 rules in this practice, and they exist to protect you from turning observation into self-attack. Rule 1. Don't interpret, no meaning-making. No conclusions. No stories. If you catch yourself interpreting, just notice that interpretation happened and return to the signal. Rule 2. Don't confront, this is not about action. Observation does not require response. Noticing does not require resolution. If you feel an urge to confront, that's another signal. Notice that. Rule 3. Don't diagnose, not yourself, not others, not the system. Diagnosis collapses curiosity into certainty. We're staying upstream of that. Why this practice works, even though it's simple. This practice works because it does something countercultural. It restores epistemic trust, trust in your capacity to know what you're experiencing without immediately explaining it away. When you repeatedly notice signals without overriding them, several things happen over time. Your nervous system settles. Your internal reference point strengthens. You become less dependent on external validation. You gain clarity without force. Not all at once, not dramatically, gradually. And because you're not acting on the signals, just noticing them, you avoid the trap of hypervigilance. You're not scanning for threat, you're tracking impact. Why this is especially important in digital spaces. In digital environments, this practice becomes even more valuable. Online, you don't have full sensory information. You don't have tone of voice. You don't have body language. So your nervous system fills in the gaps, often with anxiety, projection, or compliance. Notice, when a message leaves you unsettled, when an email makes you hesitate before responding, when a post triggers immediate alignment or shutdown. Again, not why, just that. Digital manipulation often works by speeding people up, pushing them to react, respond, share, agree. Observation slows that down. The difference between observation and withdrawal one concerned people often have is this. If I keep noticing signals, won't I just pull away from everything? No, withdrawal is a reaction to threat. Observation is a return to presence. When people withdraw, they numb. When people observe, they become more precise. You don't become colder, you become clearer. And clarity actually allows more genuine connection, not less, because you're no longer abandoning yourself to maintain harmony. What this practice gives you, and what it doesn't, let's be honest about the limits. This practice will not tell you what to do, decide who to trust, protect you from all harm, or eliminate uncertainty. What it will do is this. It will prevent you from disappearing without noticing. It will give you a pause point, a moment where you stay connected to yourself instead of immediately adapting. That pause is everything, because manipulation thrives on speed, confusion, and self-doubt. Presence disrupts all three. A quiet shift in power. When you practice observation without interpretation, something subtle changes in the relational field. You become less reactive, less pliable, less easily steered. Not because you're resisting, but because you're no longer disoriented. This often leads to one of three outcomes. The dynamic softens, the pattern becomes clearer, or the relationship reorganizes. You don't have to force any of that. It emerges naturally when your internal reference point is intact, returning to the core intention. Let's bring this back to the heart of the episode. The goal of this work is not to make you suspicious. It's not to make you defensive. It's not to make you see through everyone. It's to help you stay with yourself, especially in environments that quietly train you to leave. Observation is the simplest, safest way to begin that return. No drama, no declarations, no conclusions, just noticing. In the final section of this episode, we're going to bring everything together. Not with answers, not with solutions, but with orientation. We'll debunk one final myth, and we'll close with a reminder that this work is not about seeing danger everywhere, but about recognizing the moments you start to disappear and choosing to pause there. Section 9, Self-Reflection Prompt. Before we close this episode, we pause not to analyze, not to resolve, and not to reach conclusions, just to allow one question to surface. There's no requirement to answer it, no expectation to journal, no demand to work it out. This question isn't a task, it's an invitation. Where did I learn to override my first response in order to keep connection? That's it. You don't need to trace it back to a specific person or event. You don't need to justify it. You don't need to fix it. Simply notice what arises, if anything does. A memory, a bodily sensation, a resistance, or nothing at all. All of those responses are valid. This question isn't meant to destabilize you. It's meant to gently illuminate a pattern that many people carry without ever being asked to notice it. And if nothing comes up right now, that's fine. Sometimes questions do their work quietly, over time. We'll leave it there. Section 10, Integration and Closing Orientation, not Resolution. As we come to the end of this episode, it's important to be very clear about what we're not doing. We're not tying this up neatly. We're not offering certainty. And we're not providing a checklist for spotting manipulation everywhere you look. This work doesn't end with answers. It ends with orientation. Orientation is different from resolution. Resolution wants closure. Orientation wants bearings. Resolution says, now I know what this was. Orientation says, now I know where I am. And in complex human dynamics, orientation is far more valuable. Throughout this episode, we've deliberately resisted the urge to simplify. We didn't start with labels. We didn't rush to villains. We didn't collapse everything into pathology or intent. Instead, we stayed with patterns, mechanisms, bodily signals, language, and context. Why? Because manipulation rarely reveals itself in obvious ways. Which brings us to the myth we need to dismantle before we close. The myth. If manipulation was happening, it would have been obvious. This belief is deeply ingrained and deeply misleading. It comes from how manipulation is portrayed in films, stories, and popular discourse. Loud, aggressive, coercive, overt, someone clearly doing something to you. But that's not how most real-world influence works. The most effective manipulation doesn't feel abusive. It feels reasonable. It doesn't feel hostile. It feels relational. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens slowly, bit by bit. The reference point shifts. You speak a little less. You explain a little more. You override a signal here. You soften a boundary there. Because each step is small, it feels adaptive rather than alarming. This is why people so often say, I don't know how I ended up here. Not because they weren't paying attention, but because nothing ever crossed a line clearly enough to justify stopping. That's the quiet danger of subtle influence. It trains you to doubt the legitimacy of your own experience. So if you've listened to this episode and thought, I should have known, pause there. That thought itself is part of the pattern. The question isn't why you didn't see it sooner. The question is what conditions made it hard to see it all. And that brings us back to the core principle we've returned to again and again. This work is not about identifying bad people. It's about recognizing patterns that leave predictable damage, patterns that consistently produce confusion instead of clarity, compliance instead of consent, adaptation instead of choice, and self-doubt instead of trust. When you anchor to those outcomes, you don't need certainty about intent. You don't need to read minds. You don't need to diagnose. You only need to stay connected to what happens inside you over time. That's not paranoia. That's discernment. And discernment is quiet. It doesn't shout. It doesn't accuse. It doesn't demand immediate action. It notices. It notices when your body contracts, when your voice changes, when your perception begins to self-edit, when you feel yourself becoming smaller to keep things smooth. And then it pauses, not to judge, not to flee, but to remain present. This is the most important distinction to carry forward. The opposite of manipulation awareness is not trust. It's self-abandonment. And the opposite of self-abandonment is not suspicion, it's self-contact. This work is not asking you to see danger everywhere. It's asking you to recognize the moments you disappear and to choose, gently, not to. Sometimes that choice leads to change. Sometimes it leads to distance. Sometimes it leads to clearer conversation. Sometimes it simply leads to inner steadiness. There's no single correct outcome. Orientation gives you options. Disorientation takes them away. As we close, I want to leave you with this grounding reminder. You don't need to rush this. You don't need to decide anything. You don't need to reevaluate your entire past. Awareness unfolds at the pace your nervous system can integrate it. And if all this episode has done is help you trust one quiet signal you might previously have dismissed, that's enough. That's where clarity begins. A look ahead, episode 2, the narcissistic pattern. In the next episode, we'll take one step further. Not into diagnosis, not into blame, but into a specific pattern of influence that appears again and again across relationships, workplaces, institutions, and online spaces. We'll explore how admiration becomes regulation, how image replaces intimacy, how validation becomes leverage, and why confusion and shrinking are such common outcomes in these dynamics. We'll look at the narcissistic pattern not as a character flaw, but as a relational strategy, one that can be rewarded, normalized, and even celebrated in certain cultures and systems. And we'll continue to ask the same grounded questions. What does this pattern do? What does it produce? And what happens inside you when you're close to it? For now, thank you for listening and for staying present with something that doesn't offer easy answers, but does offer something more valuable: orientation. Until next time, you've been listening to Invisible Hands, Manipulation, Power, and the Fracturing of Perception. I'm James Miller.